Hello and welcome to KAUST Live. Over the past week, the Red Sea Research Center has been engaged in a workshop on the environmental impact of gigadevelopments on the Red Sea. Now, the workshop, which coincided with the Fall Enrichment Program, aimed to address important questions about coral reef biodiversity, the conservation of precious ecosystems, and more. Here to speak to us about that is the acting director of the Red Sea Research Center, Professor Michael Berumen. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, let's start at the big picture. What is biodiversity and why is it an important area for your research?
Biodiversity is the collection of all the living things in a given area. And there's a lot of fine definitions that you can apply to that, but the basic concept is it's all of the biology, all of the living organisms. So some people would include microbes, and then of course you've got millions and millions of things. Some people would say only other types of organisms, but it's basically all the living things in an area. And it's really important to have some idea of what that biodiversity looks like, because you can't really understand how the system functions. And all of those organisms play a role in the interactions and the healthy behavior of the system as a whole. And so in a lot of places it's very challenging to document very fully all the things that live in an area, but that's the idea behind biodiversity.
Yeah. Well, what's the state of the ecosystem as we see it now? I feel like we talk a lot about the Red Sea being a little bit of a sanctuary. It's different than some other places, but what's the picture coming into this workshop?
So the Red Sea has a huge number of habitats, and it's well known as a biodiversity hotspot for most of those types of habitats. The general picture is that the Red Sea has been pretty fortunate in terms of avoiding some of the major stresses that the rest of the world has seen in marine ecosystems. There are parts of the Red Sea which are experiencing those stresses and have had pretty negative outcomes, but the majority of the Red Sea remains in decent shape. And specifically what is coming on the Saudi side with these huge developments, these very ambitious projects, presents a challenge, because part of what Saudi's stated goals are to do these big developments while having zero impact on the environment. And so I think there's a really good role for KAUST to play in helping understand, first of all, what biodiversity is there, and second of all, how these developments can occur without having negative impacts. And that's because those are going to be the potential stresses from these developments will be on top of whatever background stresses are occurring naturally in the environment.
So then talk about the research that the Red Sea Research Center does in these different areas that touch on some of the possible developments.
So one of the first major steps is just simply to establish what lives in these areas. And that sounds like, maybe it sounds quite simple at first. Okay, you can go jump in and see what's there. But the problem that we know in most habitats is that the vast majority of species you can't see. They're living inside the framework. They're cryptic. Either they're camouflaged or they're very, very small. And so it's not always very easy to see. Most people who visit coral reefs will, of course, first focus on all the lovely fish that are around and the colorful corals, and maybe you identify some sponges and algae or clams, all these other types of organisms that live there, but you're still only looking at really a small percentage of what actually exists on that reef and what makes it function. So one of the big areas of work is first just to establish what is there. The second level then is to try to understand how those things interact and what the function of the system is. And understanding the function is really important if you're trying to protect that system, because maybe there are groups of species which do the same functions or have very similar functions, and there you have room that you have some redundancy in the roles. And in other cases you have really key species which perform functions that no other species does, and those are really critical. You can't lose those and keep the system intact. So we work at multiple levels. But starting with just establishing what's there is critical in these types of developments. But then understanding the function, and that gets into a whole another level of science that we have lots of people engaged in.
To what degree is a reef in the northern Red Sea different from one that's off the coast of Jeddah?
That's a great question, and it's one of the very first things that has to be established. And again, I come back to the first question is, are the species that live there the same? And in some cases, we are sure the answer is yes, but in a lot of cases, we see changes in the community, even especially going from the south to the north. If we look at what's here at KAUST or close to Jeddah, even some of the communities between here and the north can be different. And there are even things that only occur in the far north. There are, it's not a huge percentage, but there are some percentage of organisms which only occur in the, for example, inside the Gulf of Aqaba, in the narrow strait at the far north of the Red Sea, that don't occur anywhere else in the world, not even in the rest of the Red Sea. So those require a different level of attention than ones that might be occurring right through the entire Red Sea.
And I know that your team has gone and found literally hundreds of new species. So, I mean, percentage-wise, how much do you think we even understand the totality of species in the Red Sea, if you can quantify
Well,
that?
it's a great question, and for some biodiversity experts, this is the million-dollar question. If you actually say, if you ask me how many species are there in the whole world, or in coral reefs around the world, we don't have a great answer for that question. It's probably millions. But even in places that have been exceptionally well studied, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, or there's been huge efforts in French Polynesia, in some of these areas where there's been very focused, concentrated attempts to quantify how many species are there, even in those places, they've got tens of thousands of things that they know, but they still think that they're missing large percentages of what's really there.
Wow.
So the northern Red Sea is an area where there has been very little intensive research done outside of the hotspots of research activity in Eilat and in Aqaba, the city of Aqaba in Jordan. Those are two areas where there's been intensive work, but they're really at the far end of the Red Sea, and most of the Saudi coastline has had minimal, some initial work, but not really in depth. And so we are really hoping to develop and expand programs specifically in that area so that we can better answer the questions, what's there and how much do we not know about already. But if I had to make a rough guess about the percentage of species from the northern Red Sea that we have identified, it's probably between 5 and 10%.
Wow.
If we're talking about all the diversity that lives on those reefs or in any of those ecosystems, I'd be surprised if it's more than 10% that we have cataloged and that we can put a name on. And that's not uncommon. That's the case in most parts of the world.
We just had a guest from the Cal Academy of Sciences as part of last week's Fall Enrichment Program, Luis Rocha, and he was talking about the mesophotic zone, so I guess 50 to 100 meters in a lower section. In the Red Sea, is it very different up near the surface as opposed to this mesophotic zone?
Just like it is in every other part of the world, yes. It's going to be a really different habitat. If we could get below that top, as you say, about 50 meters, and then start looking at the reef, because the reef system continues down, but the community changes. We've gotten a few glimpses in the Red Sea to that. There's some work with submarines that we've been able to send down, or ROVs. And so we know that there's lots of life there, but, and the key thing that Luis will always point out is that the top 50 meters is relatively accessible with simple technology, just normal scuba diving. But below 50 meters, that technology isn't really ideal. And so there's a huge gap of knowledge once we get below that surface layer. The primary thing driving diversity and all that life in the top layers, it tends to be light. And so what starts to change as you get below 50 meters is you get less light. than in really shallow waters. So that changes the dynamic of how energy flows through the system, and so you typically get changes in the community of organisms that live there too.
Fascinating. So with these big projects happening in the Red Sea, and you talked a little bit about programs that the Red Sea Research Center wants to take part in. You just had a workshop. You just wrapped a biodiversity workshop. So talk a bit about the researchers that came and spoke, and give us a sense for then how KAUST is going to contribute to understanding the Red Sea and moving forward with these projects.
We had a variety of people who attended the workshop. There were a few categories of people. We had several international biodiversity experts, and typically when you talk about a biodiversity expert, they tend to be people who are highly focused on a particular group of organisms. So we had somebody here who's an expert on soft corals. That was Professor Catherine McFadden, who gave a really cool keynote with the with the Fall Enrichment Program. Right. And she's one of a few people in the world who really know soft corals and all the identification of soft corals better than anyone else will. We had another keynote talk from Professor Gustav Paulé, who has encyclopedic knowledge of invertebrates, but is probably one of the world's authorities on sea cucumbers. And we had another person who worked on zoanthids. We had a hard coral expert. We had all kinds of expertise. And so what those people have really, I wasn't trying to find out everything I could possibly find out about sea cucumbers or soft corals. As much as I think that's fascinating, we're trying to ask bigger level questions. But the point is that these are people who really have world-class expertise in knowing how biodiversity research should be done. So some of them have worked in the Red Sea before, some of them had not. But I wasn't, the point for having those people here was not to get their expertise on Red Sea biodiversity, but more broadly asking the question, how do we approach biodiversity using modern approaches? And because something we haven't mentioned yet, but the way that biodiversity work has really been advanced has been including genetic work along with the traditional taxonomic work, which involves very, very fine detailed measurements and descriptions of the anatomy of a species. And so now we're using genetic approaches combined with this traditional morphological approach, and that's really helping us solve a lot of questions about biodiversity. So we had international participants, let's say non-Red Sea based participants, that we wanted their expertise to help us understand how to tackle big questions about biodiversity. But we also had representatives from Eritrea, Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi outside of KAUST. So we had a really great diversity of researchers from the Red Sea who weren't necessarily biodiversity experts, but who know the Red Sea system. And so putting those two groups of people together was really useful in helping us define plans for how collectively we can collectively around the Red Sea, we can approach questions about biodiversity. Because as cool as it is to look at one specific system or one reef or one region, the Red Sea is a relatively small ecosystem overall. And so what happens around the Red Sea affects all parts of it. So we can't operate in isolation from that.
So the conference will eventually culminate in a paper or a set of recommendations?
Yes. We have, I think we kind of had three levels of goals. One is a very specific question about how should Saudi be approaching these huge developments, the construction of gigantic new cities, with biodiversity protection in mind. So there will be specific recommendations that we will make to those, the actual people doing the development. We will be passing on recommendations that arise directly from this workshop to help inform their process and planning. The second level of outcome is that we really are always looking to strengthen the Red Sea-wide operations and to really find new partnerships new ways that we can cooperate with other countries around the Red Sea region. And so I think we made really good progress towards that too. You know, it's just a question of always building figurative bridges and having links from country to country that enable us to operate within the whole Red Sea, so that we can not just look at one country at a time. And the third level is at a more global picture, trying to establish trying to summarize all the information that we shared, all the knowledge that was exchanged, towards the goal of saying, what would be, if hypothetically, if we had the opportunity to set the gold standard for how to measure biodiversity in a given place, what would you do? How would you approach that? And so we do hope to have a paper that actually answers that question.
It strikes me that you and the entire team in the Red Sea Research Center do a really great job of translating your science, of speaking to non-scientists. I'm curious, how do you step back from this level of detail and remember what you didn't know before you were a marine scientist?
That's a great question, and the core principles about science communication, especially for non-specialist audiences. So if you had the chance to sit in on some of these talks, I think you probably wouldn't have even followed half of the jargon that's being used, because we talk in so many acronyms and very specific things. But I don't know if I have a great answer to how to do that, but I think it's exactly as you said. Sometimes you have to step back and think, okay, what am I saying? What are the words coming out of my mouth, and what do they mean? I think that it's partly practice, at least, and I can only speak, I guess, about my experience, because I don't really have a formulaic way to approach it, but a lot of it is just practice. I'm always happy to go talk to the children at the KAUST school, for example, and if you're any good at reading your audience and just seeing how people react, are they following you? Kids are wonderful for this, because it forces you to think, how would I explain this to an 8-year-old? How would I, what would a 15-year-old find cool or interesting about this work? So I think practice in communication with those audiences is really important. I also always tell my students that they should have, in their mind, they should always have what I call the grandmother pitch. That if when you see your grandmother and she says, "So what do you do?" You need to be able to answer that question. You should always be thinking in your mind, what am I doing, and how do I explain that to someone who isn't a specialist in my field?
Right. And I can imagine that kids give you fantastic and immediate feedback if you're boring.
Absolutely. Yes. And like I said, as long as if you pick up on that, you realize quickly, okay, I'm losing them. I've got to make this relatable to them in some way that maybe I'm not doing already. So I think it's the first major step is to really be aware of who you're talking to, what your audience is, and try to speak to them and make it interesting to them.
Now, you are hosting an open conference at the end of November. So talk a little bit about what that is going to entail and what you're looking forward to with that conference.
So the Open Science Conference in our center is, we're hoping to make it an annual event. It really highlights especially student work. I think there's also plenty of postdocs who will be presenting this year, but the focus is on giving a venue to people in our center and give them an opportunity to share their projects, to share their lines of work with not only our center, but other researchers around KAUST, and actually it's open to the entire community. So we'd welcome anybody who's interested to come and see these. It's a couple of days of talks. We do invite some keynote speakers from outside. That's all student run. So the students choose who those speakers would be, and they manage the organization of the conference. And it's really been very popular in the past. And so it's just a showcase, but we really are trying to focus on the work that our students and people in our center are doing.
Good. Very good. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you spending the time.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
And that's all the time that we have for today. Remember to comment, like, and share on all the KAUST social channels. And from all of us here at KAUST, thanks for watching.